chosen to test this station's destructive power on your home planet of Alderaan, named the System Alderaan.
Bulky religions and ancient weapons are no match for a good blast. Fortune coming up on Alderaan.
You may fire when ready.
Well, the Alderaan explosion, the Explosion Network's official countdown to Star Wars Episode 9, The Rise of Skywalker. It's 28 days until release. My name is Dylan Blight, your Jedi Master, and joining me, my regular Padawans, Ashley Hobley.
Hey Dylan, excited to be here to talk about video games and TV series.
You hit the nail right on the head. And Ciaran Marchant.
Wait, we're not talking about The Last Jedi?
No, oh my God, don't do this.
Fuck, I watched it this week.
Did you really?
No, I didn't. No.
Okay, thank God.
That was, we've still got Force Awakens to fucking listen to.
Yeah,
to
I was like,
watch,
please, you're all over the place. And extra special guest for this week's episode.
You could say
Nicholas
he's almost
Pryor.
a bounty hunter.
Yeah, bounty hunter.
It's not right that you haven't granted me the rank of master.
Sorry. No. Well, I'm Jedi Master, so. And these two have been around longer than you, so. That would feel probably.
But,
Who is it?
I am arguably a bigger Star Wars fan than those two.
Yeah. I said it's Nicholas Pryor. Come over here, Jesus Christ.
Couldn't hear over the lightsaber igniting.
The
kill
silent,
us
the
younglings.
silent partner in Explosion Network.
Nick was on episode. I don't know. What one of
It
season
was
one were you on? I
Empire
don't even
Strikes
remember
Back.
I think it was Empire, yeah.
That'd be the one that
Empire.
Ashley wasn't on.
Yeah.
Ah, there you go. Okay. I was like, I remember him being on one. Also, it's quite funny this week. If you're listening to this, you're like, damn, I haven't heard Nick on much for ages. Nick's on everything but Platinum Explosion this week somehow. So there's the.
What a crazy.
Of-
Don't worry,
backwards
we're
world.
going back to edit it for me, putting me in it.
Put you in Platinum Explosion. All right. So this week's episode, we are taking a break on discussing the movies, of course, before next week we jump into The Force Awakens and then Last Jedi. And then, holy shit, we're right around the corner from the release of Rise of Skywalker. But we've had two pretty massive releases in the Star Wars universe in the past week anyway, with the release of Star Wars Jedi Fallen Order and then also The Mandalorian, as Disney Plus has released in Australia now, and there's 2 episodes of that available at the moment. So we're going to discuss Star Wars Jedi Fallen Order first and then get into a bit of The Mandalorian. I will warn you, The Mandalorian, we're going in with full spoilers open. So when we get to that point and you still haven't watched it, then you can turn off the podcast then. We're going to discuss Star Wars Jedi Fallen Order with a spoiler-free zone on it because it is a game. It's much longer. It's much bigger. I wouldn't expect everyone to have suddenly finished that yet. But jumping into that, Star Wars Jedi Fallen Order is set 5 years after the events of The Revenge of the Sith. It is the first fully story-centric game we've had in the 6 years that EA has had the Star Wars license. But I'm going to ask everyone the question that's played it. That's everyone but Nick. The question of, does it tell an interesting enough story to salivate us, its audience? Ash, from what you've played so far, because you haven't finished it, how much are you enjoying the story for Jedi Fallen Order? How do you feel about its characters? How do you feel about its relevance as a Star Wars story? Because I have one more asterisk on this. We're not discussing the gameplay here because this is Alderaan Explosion. If you want to hear us discuss Jedi Fallen Order's gameplay, go listen to this week's episode of Arcade Couch. We are focusing on this game as a story property within the Star Wars.
Something very precious to the Empire. We're done hiding, Cal. Are you with us?
We're in.
I mean, I feel like I've gotten to an interesting segment of the story, but it doesn't feel like it's having an impact on the world overall. Obviously, you're getting a bit more backstory on the antagonists of the game, which were previously in Rebels, I believe.
Yeah.
The second sister.
Explain the opening of the game in your point of view, because I think I would have a different view on it, like, because I already know about Inquisitors and stuff. But like, if you want to explain the opening and how you felt about it, or if it was like, who the fuck are the Inquisitors?
I knew the basic concept of Inquisitors, so I knew there were people who were hunting Force-sensitive people, keep the little people down, keep the Jedi down to make sure they didn't come back. That's their purpose. But that first section of the game is like my favorite part of the game, I think, which is an issue.
So The opening of the game, I don't think it's a massive spoiler to say this, obviously. The opening game, like the first hour, is Cal Kestis, a Padawan. When the Order 66 happened, he was a Padawan. He's been hiding for 5 years. He's working on Bracca, this new planet that was invented for the game. It's also a planet that shows up in the recent Resistance Reborn novel as well. And technically it shows up there first because that novel was invented first. Released first, sorry. So he's working on this planet. He's scrapping ships from the Clone Wars period, and then his friend basically falls off one of the ships, and he has to use his force powers to save him, even though he hasn't used them for 5 years. And then that leads the Empire to find out he's there, and the Empire sends down a couple Inquisitors, the second sister and the ninth sister, to kill him, of course. And he makes a run for it, and you've got the first hour of the game is this very Uncharted-like action sequence as he makes his way to escape, and he's eventually saved by mental blanking on the character's name, but this Sir, that's it. Sir? Yeah. Who was a fully fledged Jedi during the events of Revenge of the Sith, but who has also cut herself off from the Force and no longer works as a Jedi. And then the core concept for the game from that point on is trying to restore the Jedi Order. But that first hour is very like rich, like action scene and whatever else is happening. And it's like, hey, Inquisitors, all these sorts of things. Yeah. But how... continuing with you, Ash.
Yep.
The core concept and story of having to go to these different places, and because the main pull of the game is going as Cal, trying to restore the Jedi Order is basically what his mission is. And you're going to these different locations trying to find your way to a Jedi hologram that is said to contain the names of a bunch of Force-sensitive children across the galaxy. And that's what he wants to find. That's the general MacGuffin of the movie. Of course, the Empire wants that as well because they want to kill all the Force-sensitive children. Are you enjoying that pull, that story?
I mean, it's fine. I mean, it gives you a purpose to go through. I don't know how much a list of Force-sensitive people is going to impact anybody, especially seeing it's like 6 years later. But yeah, it's enough of a hook to get you to keep going. I think it's more about the characters, other characters that are more interesting. Sir and the ship captain, what's his name? Grease, they're fun to talk to and stuff.
I was about to say, put it this way, they're so interesting you remember their names very well.
Yeah. I would just think of it, the captain bearded dude with lots of arms. But yeah, I enjoy the cutscenes, but there's so much gameplay in between getting to each story point, I feel is... The story in this game is trickled out very slowly.
Mm-hmm. Ciaran, how are you feeling about it so far? The general story, the general pool, Cal as a character.
I think I really enjoy the game. I feel I've already said this on Arcade Couch. I think I do feel very biased because I'm at a point of my Star Wars interests that I am very much like just wanting more to experience more within the Star Wars universe at the minute. So to have this game, and I think this is the best game since Knights of the Old Republic, to actually feel like I'm like a part of that world and to be able to explore that universe a lot more. Cal's a character. Well, he's kind of cardboard, but like I think I didn't get the sense, and this is where I'm...
He's cardboard.
He's cardboard. Yeah. Well, I think this is where me coming from, I'm, listening through the Resistance Reborn book at the moment, and I really like the stories and the characters that book is telling, and there is signs of... differential in prowess, I guess, is when it comes to character development and actually talking about characters and making characters interesting. I feel like the story isn't always the emphasis of the game, sadly. And I really am enjoying the game. Don't get me wrong. I'm really high on this game, but I think as a Star Wars game itself, I think it does a good job of setting some things up and giving us more information in a different format that people are more readily able to get. But I think in certain points, it's weaker on individual character basis, if that makes sense.
Can I just from what I've heard, it sounds like it's trying to tell too big of a story. Like trying to rebuild the Jedi Order, like one Padawan. I don't know. It just feels like a missed opportunity. They could have told a more personal story. This is granted, obviously, from secondhand knowledge.
I was pretty surprised when it came up about looking for a holocron that contained a list of Force-sensitive users, because I guess the problem is when the story is that, it kind of, for me as part of a narrative, it shuts down the possibilities for the end of the game, because we know that this isn't where the Jedi Order springs back up. We know that this isn't where all of this stuff comes back together. So where does this game end? And I think that it kind of limits its ending. If it was more to tell the story of Cal and tell his story of him rejoining the Force and the things he goes through in this period of time, I think it would be a lot more interesting than having it about rebuilding the Jedi Order.
Yeah, so the general pool of like rebuilding the Jedi Order, I found to just be a very boring main plot, because I predicted what was going to happen in like my first couple hours of playing the game. As soon as I found out what the general thing was going to happen, I'm like, bet you this is going to happen, and it's exactly what happened.
How many times have you seen that kind of story played out in Star Wars as it is?
Exactly. It's a very boring, done before, several different ways, similar storyline happen. And the way it plays out is very predictable, and that doesn't make it super fun. Now, I would forgive it if the characters were interesting enough, but as I've said, I don't find Cal interesting. He has no charm about him. He has no real like pull. Like his whole thing is just like, oh, I get, like, I'm sick of running, I'm going to help rebuild the Jedi Order, but it's never like super, there's any depth to him at all. It's just like that's what he suddenly decides and that's what he's doing, but you never get any more depth to him as a character, really. Cia is actually a little bit more interesting because of what she's had to do and what she's been through since Order 66. But the most interesting character in the game that you barely get to go over, but is still the most interesting in the character in the game, is the second sister. Eventually you start to learn more about her character, and then it just really made me wish the game was actually about her. And she was the main character and was playing the game from her point of view, and you were still trying to chase after Cal or whatever, but then I wouldn't care because he was boring, but I'm like, oh, whatever, he's just the fucking like the villain, I guess, in that weird scenario. But they wouldn't be brave enough to do a game from the point of view from an Inquisitor. Like, that's not what people want to play as. They want to play as a good guy, they want to play as the Jedi. But Cal is just such a weatherboard of a stereotypical good guy Jedi character that he's just not exciting and not fun. And the game, another really interesting character is the Night Sister you meet on Dathomir, when you start to learn more about her and what choices she's made and these sorts of things. As someone who's obviously watched all of the Clone Wars and everything, they start talking about the fact that her people were all, she talks about the fact that all of her people were killed off. Like, she's like, oh, a mechanical monster came down and like killed all my people and stuff. And it's an obvious, she's obviously talking about what happens in the Clone Wars. They cover what happens to Mandalore. They cover what happened. Like General Grievous and everyone goes down there and like they take a whole army down there and they kill everyone. Like they go after everyone down there. So she starts talking about that. And obviously I grabbed onto that because she's talking about events from other things, and that's really interesting. And her being like one of possibly a few sole survivors of a slaughter done by basically the Empire. It wasn't the Empire at the time, but you know, what became the Empire basically, because it was orders coming from Dooku, which is the Empire nonetheless. So like that was super interesting as her as like a sole survivor of that, possibly sole survivor. And she was also super interesting, but Cal just so boring amongst all these other way more interesting characters. And I think the other thing that annoys me is they got asked, like, he's like such a stereotypical just white dude boring character. And I always remember back in the interview where they asked why they picked to do like that character in the game, and the answer that Stig Emerson gave at the time in the interview was that, well, we've got Rey in the movies, and he's like, well, so that's why we had to do boring character. I'm like, okay, well, can do an alien? I don't know, anything, like just like any, like go crazy. I don't know, like
even just break the mold of what we know a Jedi as, because I'm really, just once, can we have a protagonist of a Star Wars game or movie that isn't good with robots and technical stuff? Like every single protagonist or main character seems to be a whiz with robots.
That's
like
a
all the
requirement.
time, and It's just, it just seems to be like they can all talk to them, they can all fucking fix them, and I'm like, can like even just playing this, I was like, oh, that's a traditional, that's a constant trope we get in Star Wars all the time, is that the main character just knows what to do with them. It's like, I just want something different, in it.
I think this in particular, more than anything, has fallen more as a victim of the business side more than anything else. Because I think for them to get a hit, they wanted to hit those beats of what people are familiar with, a story that people are kind of going to be sort of invested in, like a plain white Jedi. Like I think, it's the most gone down to the business side of Star Wars.
Yeah.
Especially in the gaming arena, I guess.
Especially when it's almost like EA's playing it safe. Not to go too far into that, but EA's playing it safe to be like, hey, we can actually do this sort of Star Wars game. Like, it's almost like they're trying to prove something.
My one last thing I want to say on the story for this game and the characters, before we move on to Mandalorian, is that after I beat the game, I booted up Battlefront 2 and I played through the DLC for that, because when the DLC released for that originally, I had already traded in my copy of the game. So I just watched the story of that through YouTube videos at the time, because I was like, oh, fuck it. But I was like, oh, actually, it's been so long, even though I know what's happened, I want to play through it. I want to get back to those characters. And not to say that Battlefront 2 is perfect, but playing through the DLC for Battlefront 2, I was like, all of these characters are way more interesting than any of the characters that are in Jedi Fallen Order. In fact, to the point that a lot of these characters are in Resistance Reborn. Shriv and
her daughter,
the main character's daughter, yeah. Like, they're literally some of the main characters in that book. They've shown up in other things as well. Like, even if you don't love that game's at least created interesting and fun characters that are going to carry on into future Star Wars properties and have carried on into future Star Wars properties. And one thing I can say for sure with Jedi Fallen Order is I do not care if I see any of these characters ever again.
Or even just the mention of them. Like, even in Resistance Reborn, when Inferno Squadron's brought up, there was a sense of excitement for me. There was a sense of interest where it's like, oh shit, yeah, Inferno Squadron, that's being brought into this. Like, that Battlefront 2 story actually meant something. That's so cool. Like, that's really good. Where I'm starting to get the feeling that Jedi Fallen Order won't be like that.
Whether you think it worked or not, at least Battlefront 2's story tried to do something different.
My main problem with it isn't with its story. It's just I feel all the level design itself was very much like tutorial stuff for the multiplayer. Of course, yeah. So the story I enjoyed, the level design I did not. And for people that think that's all one and the same, it is not. They're completely different. I think Battlefront 2 has an interesting story behind it. It's just the level design wasn't fun enough to drive forward the story and the characters it had that was actually quite interesting. Inferno Squad, the book that's set before the game, that's really interesting. The characters really interesting. The characters continue to be interesting in the game. They just didn't have as great a game to play with. Okay, let's move on to The Mandalorian. So Mandalorian is 2 episodes deep at the moment. That's how much it launched with on Disney+. 3rd episode is out this Friday, of course, tomorrow, day of releasing. Then one through basically ends the last week of the year or something like that, through by the time we get to the last one. So I want to get, although me and Ash have discussed it, because we are doing The Mandalorians, our Mandalorian after show, which will be coming out each week after each episode. The first episode we discussed chapter 1 and 2, but I want to talk a little bit here to, obviously, Ciaran and Nick haven't had a chance to discuss the show, and I want to get an overall opinion on it, not like boiling down what happens moment by moment in the episode.
Look outside. Is the world more peaceful since the revolution? It is good to restore the natural order of things.
So, starting with you, Ash, since we've already discussed and everything, what are your overall thoughts on the series so far? 2 episodes in.
Yeah, it's pretty good. It definitely feels of the original trilogy era. Not as flashy and shiny as the prequels or the current Star Wars trilogy. So yeah, enjoyable. Nice to see a bounty hunter. Nice to see somebody fighting creatures, alien creatures, and getting their ass handed to them constantly. You know?
Plus, I feel like everyone just wants to end it with plus baby
Yoda. Plus Yiddle.
Yeedle. Yeah. That, by the way, if you haven't listened to Mandalorian yet, I should have gave the extra spoiler warning, but I already gave it to you, by the way. We're full spoilers. Thank you. Love you. See you later. Yeetle is the official name the Explosion Network has gave Lord Baby Yoda. And we're not going over why it's wrong or right to call it Baby Yoda again, because we went over that again. And stop yelling at people on the internet for saying it and being fucking nerd fanboys, because what the hell else are people supposed to call it? We don't know its species. Saying Baby Yoda is perfectly fine.
On
when we don't know
Wikipedia,
species.
it's called Yoda species.
Yeah, well, I keep seeing nerds online like correcting people, being like, well, it's actually not Baby Yoda because blah, 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 blah. I'm like, I'm pretty sure the person's probably aware. It's just, what the fuck else do you call it? We don't know. Get over it, dude. Ah, fuck. Ciaran, what are your thoughts on the series so far?
Overall, I really like it. I really enjoyed the first episode and the second. I enjoyed both episodes a lot. I've watched them both twice now. I don't know if disappointed is the right word, but I was a little. It's kind of disappointment when the child used the Force. I was a little bit disappointed because I didn't want anything like the Force being included in this series in my original, like what I wanted for this. But that's only a really small minor point for me, because like I really like what they do with that. That child's really fun in the second episode, and it has some really cool moments throughout the whole thing. Jawas, I was smiled as soon as I saw Jawas were in that fucking episode and what they were doing. Even just like the little things, like there was a small, I don't know if it's a scene, but it's a small transitioning section where the Mandalorian is sat in the Jawas vehicle, and like just the scale of the inside of that cockpit compared to him was just really interesting and funny to see, because it was just not something we'd seen before, and it always looks big because the Jawas look big and it like look small in it, and it's not the case. So yeah, no, I really liked it. I think it's a good shit.
Also, Dylan, for episode 1 of Mandalorians, it's a sand crawler.
Thank you.
You're welcome.
I did mental. Yeah, I fumbled on that one. Yes, I know. I get 20 points taken off me every time I forget something Star Wars related, apparently. But there you go. Ciaran, what are your Nick, what are your overall thoughts on the show so far?
I'm really high on the first 2 episodes. If it's consistent in its quality and the way it keeps going, I think it's going to be one of my favorite Disney produced Star Wars things so far. Like, I love it's. I just feel like it's so different to everything else. Like, I like the more, I guess, Western influences. The more, I guess, like he comes across as a more Western movie kind of character, like a silent, not so much silent, but like only speaks when it's necessary, kind of like stoic kind of character. And it's the storytelling is through the world and the interactions with him, I guess.
Yeah, in my review, I compared it to like The Good, the Bad, and the Ugly.
Yeah.
Not only from like a character perspective with the Clint Eastwood's character, kind of like the lone gunman, but then also I feel like the music in the show, which I absolutely love, doesn't sound exactly like, but seems like it's inspired by Sergio Leone's music that he does as well. So,
and even some of the shots, like the wide shots over the open terrain, and even at the beginning when he walks into the bar, and you could like copy and paste that from a Western movie and put it into that. Like I just like how unique it feels, at least at this point. The other thing, I don't know if I'm concerned about it, but I read that Lucas always wanted to keep Yoda's species a mystery, and I don't know if they're gonna, if like Favreau and Disney are gonna honor that, or if they just have their own kind of plans for it.
I think there's enough elements of mystery already in that character, and I don't think there's ever going to be a point in this story where we get much more deeper information about that character.
Which I hope.
I disagree solely for one reason. Well, hold on. Before I get to that, let me just quickly say that I really enjoy the show. I feel like that's obvious. It's Star Wars. It would be weird if I hate it. Well, actually, I don't like Star Wars Jedi Fallen Order, so
yeah, I
maybe
was
not.
going to say.
But I really enjoyed the first episode. I just found it like for newcomers that aren't like super deep in Star Wars, I reckon the first episode would be quite confusing. My brother watched it. He found it quite confusing. He was like asking me a million and one questions. When's it set? Why is this character Boba Fett but not Boba Fett? Why there's stormtroopers here if it's after the Empire's fallen? You know, like there's a million, like, is this Tatooine? Is this planet Tatooine? Like every planet, is this Tatooine? I'm like, you know, like that sort of stuff. So I'm loving it. I enjoyed the second episode a lot more than the first because I found the pacing to be a little bit less hectic and a little bit more focused. The big reveal that comes, I absolutely love. I love where this series is going with the relationship between the Mando and the child. That's when I said like on the Mandalorian, that is the show. And Ash was like, "Is it there?" And I'm like, "That is the show. The show is literally going to be him and that child. That is what the concept is."
Just a note on that, the reveal at the end of the first episode. I am so glad that I was not spoiled in that because that was a
shocking moment.
a genuine jaw-dropping moment. Like, wow, what the fuck?
Yeah,
kind of thing.
So I can tie that into what I was going to say before about Yoda as well because I watched an interview today that has come up since we recorded The Mandalorians with both Jon Favreau and Dave Filoni. And they talked about several things in it. One, they talked about not having the Yoda child spoiled. And they discussed how the only reason it wasn't spoiled for people, and I don't mean like people spoiling it on Twitter between the week when Australia and America, I mean like prior to that. He said that the real reason it wasn't spoiled, because they kept it out of the trailers, he said was thanks to Disney's willingness for them to be like, hey, we don't want this spoiled. You can't make merchandise. And in the interview, Jon Favreau says most of the time when stuff gets spoiled for Marvel movies, Star Wars movies, whatever it is, it's because something will leak from a merchandising company, be that a t-shirt, a toy, a fucking Legos, you know, any of these sorts of things. And they told Disney that we do not want any merchandise made for this. They said they understood that people would want the merchandise. And yes, people want the merchandise. I want the fucking merchandise. I want a plushie of that goddamn Yoda baby thing, Yeetle. Of course we do. Heaps of people want that. But they said Disney was willing to be like, okay, we're going to play ball. And I think that's a pretty good move on Disney's part for them to actually play ball with that request, especially because that's a very anti-money decision for them to make, really, not to have the merchandise ready to pump out after the series is aired. In that same interview, they talked about how Dave Filoni talked about how when Jon Favreau came to him with the idea for the show first and he pitched it, the first pitch he gave for the show was it's about Mando and this child. That's how he pitched the show. So to me, that confirms that the show is that. It's not that that child's going to disappear on episode 3, 4 and the show's going to go somewhere else. That is the show. If that's how he was pitching the show's about their relationship. He said that Jon Favreau pitched it to him, and then straight away he was highly intrigued, and Dave Filoni said he felt obligated to become part of the project simply because of his relationship with George Lucas. For those who don't know, Dave Filoni is basically, if you want to look for anyone that's like the prodigal son and follow up for George Lucas, it's Dave Filoni. Dave Filoni was handpicked to come in and work on the Clone Wars when Lucas was starting that. He is the person that basically everyone goes to at Lucasfilm when it comes to, well, how would George feel about this? What would George do here? These sorts of things. And it's because he's would listen and talk to George all the time. George Lucas has gave interviews and said the reason he liked Dave Filoni so much is because Dave Filoni was someone who wouldn't sit there and interrupt George. He would let George just talk and talk and talk because Dave wanted to just listen to him and take in the information and get an understanding of George Lucas and his view on Star Wars. So he said when he heard that Jon Favreau wanted to play around with the Yoda species, he said that he felt obligated to come in and be a part of it because he knew that George didn't want to reveal the species, and he had explained to Dave why he didn't want to reveal the species and these sorts of things. So he said he wanted to be part of that. Now, whether or not Dave Filoni has been told by George years ago what George considers the name of Yoda's species, these sorts of things, I would say if George does have that information in his head, Dave knows it. I would say that anything that's in George's head that he's let out, Dave is the one person in the world I would say that knows these sorts of things. And another thing is that George Lucas visited the set of The Mandalorian a lot, like more than he visited anything else, I think, at this stage. Like there is photos and stuff of him showing up and visiting the show a lot, and reports show that he is quite a fan of what he was watching happening on the show, what was happening behind the scenes, everything else that's going down. So I think if they're going to do a reveal of the species name and explore more about what the species is, what they're about, I think it would seem like it has not only George's blessing, but Dave Filoni's there to be the George Lucas sit-in shepherd to make sure that that reveal and playing with that information is done right. And that's the reason I will feel good and safe about this show doing that and handling that information, because Dave Filoni's involved. If it was anyone else, if it was just Jon Favreau by himself, I would say no. But there are two executive producers on this show. It's Jon Favreau and it's Dave Filoni. That's why it's wrong.
I agree with you, but at another extent, if they do keep on going along this Western kind of like feeling and inspiration, a lot of those stories are told without exposition or kind of backstories on any of the characters as well. So I think I can see it playing out either way, whether they just don't reveal anything at all, or if they do decide to do it, you've convinced me that they will do it with some semblance of kind of respect.
Well, I think when discussing the show going forward, I think the child character is obviously the most important and interesting one. It's very easy to like gloss over it, but I think there's a lot important about that character and information they've given us so far that begs a lot of questions and theories. Of course, why were they out there? Were all those people paid to look after him? Were all those people there in that location protecting it for their own uses? Did they know that it was force sensitive? Were they protecting it because they thought it was force sensitive? You know, like that's question A. Question B, we find out it's 50 years old. That is not a random number picked out of a hat. That is a very specific number that means something to the show. 50 years would place it shortly before The Phantom Menace. That thing has lived through the entirety of all 6 films and what's been going on in the background. So then it begs the question of, does the Emperor know about him? Does Darth Vader know about him? You know, like there's lots of interesting little bits of information there. And then it's, of course, the third piece of information that the second episode opens up that I think is most interesting is, because when I went into the second episode, I was like, I wonder if it's force sensitive? Like, because so far we've seen 2 Yoda species, right? Yoda and Yaddle. Both of them are force sensitive. So far, 100% of that species is force sensitive that we know of. Not to say they all have to be, of course, that would be silly to assume, but that's what we know about. They've now confirmed that this character is force sensitive as well. So then it's like 3 for 3. Is Yoda's species such a rarity species, so few left, that basically whenever one comes about, they are just always force sensitive? You know, like they're a very force in tune species. Is that simply how they work? That could be an interesting thing to explore, especially for a species, because there's no other species like that in Star Wars that we know of. That's like, apart from fucking midichlorians, I suppose. Like they're the most force sensitive things.
One thing about that too, with it being 50, it raises a kind of overall kind of continuity kind of thing, because I believe I was reading somewhere that Yoda was teaching Jedi at 100. So if that's the case, it's gonna mature. It hasn't matured very much, I guess, because it still looks like a baby at 50. It's, I guess, kind of.
I think we're all calling it a baby because it's like easiest, but the episode does call it a child. So I think like within the show itself, they would want you to consider it a child, not a baby.
Yeah.
It's just the internet obviously names it Baby Yoda.
Oh yeah, of course.
It looks like a baby.
Yeah.
So
we don't know what the size they are when they're born, so it might be halfway through its growth cycle, but it looks like it's in its infancy. I guess.
Yeah.
The other point, not to deviate too far from that, but the other point that most surprised me in the opening couple of episodes was there being a community or another contingent of Mandalorians, which was not something I was expecting to see in this show.
Early? I was expecting
either
to see it
so early, and I didn't expect it. I was expecting for another Mandalorian or a group of Mandalorians to show up towards the end of the season, as we discussed, with, you know, his identity being more revealed. But there is that lingering, the statement of your signet
being revealed.
Been revealed, and there's this, you know, underlying plot there, underlying kind of string there of, okay, what the fuck's going on here then? Like, what did she mean by that? What exactly is going on?
They get that entire scene that plays out in the Mandalorian guild section is what I'm referring to it as, because he does enter a room that has the Mandalorian symbol on the top of the room, the crests and everything like that. So, and then there's several Mandalorians sitting around. But yeah, obviously the keywords in that whole scene are Beskar, and if you don't know what that is, it's like you better Google it quickly because it's very important. It's the Mandalorian steel. It's like their version of kyber crystals, I guess. It's like, you know, you build some shit out of that. It's tough as fuck. Sabine Wren in the Rebel series, the reason she kind of abandons her people is because she starts working for the Empire when she's a lot younger, unknowing of like how bad they are, of course, and she builds a weapon that's made out of Beskar that basically helps the Empire take down her people, and she feels terrible for herself about it. So Beskar shows up a lot in Rebels. That's the material he's going to be after to get all that. Interesting. Once again, once we finish recording The Mandalorians, I start thinking about more things that I hadn't thought about when I was recording it. But I'm like, oh yeah, they did have like an Empire crest on it. So it's like the Empire has like taken all of this Beskar and then like imprinted their own symbol into it and everything.
The thing it reminds me the most of is the Nazis and the gold.
Yes.
The stolen gold bullion.
Yes, exactly. That's a very good connection. So then the next thing they bring up is the whole the signet thing that Ciaran just mentioned. Has your signet been revealed yet? He says no. She asked, and he says no. It's like, what the fuck does that mean, really? What is his signet? How important is his signet? Is he keeping it a secret for a reason? To affect what, who, when? And then the third keyword for that whole scene is the foundlings thing, of which he says that he once was a foundling, as we see a flashback sequence to Clone Wars era where a child, we're presuming is him because it's playing out like it's in his head, like you're remembering it, is hidden away, very like Jyn Erso-esque is what I compared it to from Rogue One. He's hidden away and then I guess found eventually by potentially the Mandalorians, and then they help raise him. But then that does beg a question of, was he actually a Mandalorian in the first place? Or was he simply a found child that was raised under Mandalorians and then made a part of the guild? You know, like, is he actually a quote-unquote full Mandalorian? Or does that not actually matter for Mandalorians these days? Especially when their planet during this time period is dwindling, pretty much destroyed under the Empire's reign. We know as much as that from the Rebels. Like, their planet was being pulled apart, destroyed, nearly all killed down. We're definitely going to get to cover that because obviously, once again, Dave Filoni's involved with the show and he did Clone Wars, so that's all going to become a part of it. But yeah, there's lots of really interesting nuggets thrown out very quickly for an episode that's only 38 minutes, and then the second episode that's only 30 minutes, and it's a lot to take in, I would say, especially for your average Joe Schmo.
It definitely feels like it's made more for the fan as opposed to the general consumer.
It's weird to say, but like, as much as like the animated TV shows are made for kids, right? This does still just remind me more of watching Rebels or Clone Wars than it does a movie, because it's already just playing in weird and wacky stuff. Like, that's another thing I love straight away at the episode. It's like, here's a fucking dude with a flute. Here's here's some crazy alien creatures. Like, the show's already just gone weird and wacky. Talking about weird and wacky, the final question I do want to ask everyone about The Mandalorian is, do you think that anything that happens in this series before the release date of the next couple of weeks, before the release date of The Rise of Skywalker, could be relevant towards that movie at all?
No.
No?
No.
No, I hope not.
Hope not?
I could see potentially, like, maybe somewhere in this series we see the glimmer of the beginning of the First Order. I could definitely think we could see that in this. I don't know how much that's going to relate to Rise of Skywalker, but I think that's something that could definitely be played on through this, with what we've already got with those remnants of the Empire being there. There's obviously going to be more to that.
I'll tell you what I don't want.
Are you more thinking that the Yaddle kind of character would show up?
Or anything that's connected. It doesn't matter if it's big or small.
Really hoping 75-year-old Yaddle doesn't show up in Rise of Skywalker and save the day.
That's definitely not going to happen.
Nick Nolte.
Yeah. I'll tell you what, he's looking good. in the show. They didn't have to do any work on him.
He has spoken.
Yeah, that I have spoken. That's the absolute. It's my, as much as I love cute Baby Yoda, I have spoken is my favorite thing this year.
One thing that was a treat to see was the IG droid in action in live
finally
action
get to
for
see
Star
an
Wars.
IG droid do something. Yeah,
and it makes sense the way it's designed with like the head spinning around and just going everywhere.
Yeah, well, it's because Dave
really
Filoni.
cool.
A lot of this show is just Dave Filoni's dreams from when he was a kid watching Empire, and finally having a chance to be like, well, this is how that works. You know, he was playing these action figures when he was a child, and he's now able to be like, the action figures I had now do this. I'll say that I do think there will be a connective fabric. I do think it will be a tiny thing, and I do think it will be to do with the First Order. The most outrageous thing I could say as like a connective thing that wouldn't really matter and wouldn't affect people not watching the show, but would be like a cool thing to see, would be to see I think what's the character's name? Captain Pride? Yeah, Pride, right? It's this new character that's being introduced in the Rise of Skywalker being played. Oh fuck, I forget who's actually playing him now. I should look it up. Jesus Christ. We haven't seen him in any of the trailers, yet he was one of the first actors revealed in the first photos for it, and he was next to Domhnall Gleeson's character, and he's part of the Richard E. Grant, Allegiant General Pride is who he's playing. So presumably a First Order character of prominence, because in the photo they released for him, he is standing sitting down, and Domhnall Gleeson's General Hux is standing up behind him, like very much like he's behind, like General Pride is the one in command of this situation, what's happening here. So I feel like a cool but not important possibly connection would be to have him show up maybe just as like a character and hint at towards him having something prominent to do with the emergence of the First Order, creation of the First Order, these sorts of things. And then you could have obviously his character show up in Rise of Skywalker. And then for people that have been watching both shows, it's like, okay, so that dude's been around for so long. He was basically there at the start of the First Order. That's cool. But it's not super important and wouldn't ruin your watching of the movie if you don't have that information. I feel like that's a connection we could have.
What if the Mandalorian is Rey's dad?
Far out.
Yeatle is actually Snoke.
Rey has been a Mandalorian all along.
Kieran's having his mind blown. He's like, oh my God, Yeatle's actually Snoke. Oh my God.
Oh, you fucking Nimrods.
Yeah, any last thoughts or things anyone wants to go over before we end this one? Random Mandalorian thoughts?
I'm super excited for the next episode of Mandalorian. Like, I think a lot happens. Well, no, I think a decent amount happens next episode, because I think we get more from the Mandalorian Guild. I think we get more from the Empire. Hopefully, unless it's going to be a random, like, quote-unquote filler episode.
No, there's no filler episodes in this show.
Yeah.
No.
Yeah, I hope not.
I'm more excited for the remainder of this series than I am for Rise of Skywalker.
That's some big words.
Big words.
Whatever floats your boat, I guess. I'm excited for this and the Rise of Skywalker. I'm excited to be watching Star Wars weekly. That's exciting.
This makes me even more excited for Rise of Skywalker.
Yeah.
I even started looking at possibly buying my Rise of Skywalker midnight release
Wow,
ticket.
you know, don't go too hard, Kieran. Don't buy them ahead of time. Let's not be crazy or anything over there. All right, that's it for this week's episode of Alderaan Explosion. Next week, we will be discussing The Force Awakens, so make sure you watch the movie before then so you can play along at home. Please share this episode on social media and tag @ExplosionPod if you're enjoying it. Tell your friends and rate on Apple Podcasts or Podchaser. Alderaan Explosion is a Darth production of ExplosionNetwork.com, which is where you can also find What Do You Want to Watch, our fortnightly movie and TV podcast, and also where you can find The Mandalorians, our Mandalorian after show, which goes up every week now. You can follow me on Twitter @VivaLadil, VIVALADIL. You can follow Ash on Twitter @Ashley Holby, ASHLEYHOBLY. You can follow Kieran on Twitter @YupBoyRingo. And you can follow Nick on Twitter while he's tweeting at the moment @Lord N. Pryor. May the Force be with you. Always.